Hello everybody, welcome to The Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for Some Stuff I Missed, where I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but, you know, some of it. Oh, here we have yet another one of these roundups that completely got away from me. We got another whopping 30 releases to cover today, though this is a mix of projects from 2022, a bunch left over from 2021, and even one from 2020, because why not? A ton of stuff that's resulted from Bandcamp diving and finding so many releases that haven't gotten much attention. And there's a bunch more new releases that just came out like right as I was getting near finished writing this, and I may have to save for the next one, we'll see. As per usual, if you want to know my favorite and least favorite tracks on a given release, I have a pastebin document linked in the description. But yeah, we've got lots of stuff to get through, so let's just get into it. Starting off with Soichi Terada with Asakusa Light. Soichi Terada is a pioneer in the genre of deep house, probably best known for his soundtracks to the Ape Escape video game series, but he's been at it since the early 90s, started up his own label called Far East Recording, which he primarily used to self-release his work, alongside fellow Japanese deep house producer Shinichiro Yokota. And this project was Terada's first full album of new original material in over 25 years. I'll freely admit that I didn't even know who this guy was before seeing this album highlighted as new and notable by Bandcamp. I've never even played any Ape Escape games, and I've not heard any of this guy's previous albums. This album is the only thing I've heard from him. I threw it on here mostly on the promise of the cool looking album cover, but not that it really matters. I'm recommending it anyway because it's really freaking nice. It's not anything game-changing. It's a pretty standard old-school deep house record with all the usual smooth pads and rounded can-you-feel-it bass lines. And there's not an absolute ton of sonic variety to offer either. For the most part, the 11 tracks on here sound pretty similar, but it just really puts me in a good mood. It's really nice and uplifting and laid back in the way the best old-school deep house is, and all of these grooves are perfectly crafted for what they are. There's an undeniable charm to the whole thing that makes it kind of impossible to dislike. Highlights include the playful Bamboo Fighter with its occasional flute riffs, the piano-tinged Double Spire, and Marimbo. I think the former of those was my favorite cut in the bunch. Also love the pan flutes on Runners, and the thick and grooving Soaking Dry, which I'm told is a cover of the track Soaking Wet by Groove City. The album does have its share of less interesting moments that don't grab me nearly as much, but the moments that do hit easily make it worth it. And my day was definitely made that little bit better by listening to it, so yeah, I'll give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Oval, Ovidono. Right, Oval just released his latest album in like the very last week of 2021, and well, it's very much not like any other Oval albums I've heard to date. Directly bucking against the ridiculously over-the-top approach to glitchy house bangers as seen on his Pop and Skis albums, Ovidono is more like a low-key, experimental modern classical outing, which combines very peaceful blends of pianos and flutes and strings, with glitched-up whispered narration and Japanese poetry from Vladka Alek and Eriko Toyota. The approach to the inclusion of their vocals is extremely ASMR-inspired, to the point where the album was even sort of billed as ASMR 2.0 in its marketing. As always, I do have to give Oval credit for continuing to push the envelope and try new things, though I did attempt to get into this one right before the end of the year and got really thrown off by the vocals, hence getting relegated to this roundup. Coming back to it now, I'll admit the vocals aren't quite as off-putting as they were on first listen. I guess they're an acquired taste and obviously add that unique texture to make it recognizable as Oval. Though they are still more of a distraction for me than a selling point, and they do wear out on me the longer the album stretches on. He's lucky I happen to be a total sucker for these kinds of low-key piano compositions, though, because they do really carry the album for me and give the album much more of a sense of emotional warmth that I almost never get out of Oval albums. Any of the moments that don't include the vocals are really deep and immersive, and I can really get into them, so I guess that all evens out to me feeling like this album is pretty decent for what it is. I can see it working a lot better for other people who are able to vibe with the concept more. I just don't think it's a keeper or an overlooked gem, so I think I'll give this a 6.7 out of 10. Next up, from Subtronics, Fractals.
We don't need space, I think we need time.
What? Gotta have some mainstream EDM in my system every now and then. I'll admit I've never heard any other releases by this rhythm dubstep producer aside from this. Only ever heard about him in passing. Though I was interested in hearing this after seeing some positive reviews from the EDM loving crowd, as well as seeing other people mark it as one of the worst albums they've ever heard. I've legit seen this album compared to stuff like Tiesto's Kaleidoscope and the Chainsmokers' Memories Do Not Open, and okay, really? This? One of the worst of all time? Are you serious? I'm not about to tell you this thing is great or anything, but I enjoyed it for what it was. I guess if you hate mainstream EDM on principle, and I know plenty of people do, then of course you're not gonna like this. But I know this genre has plenty of material I am able to get into, so I've always made sure not to just reject this kind of material out of hand. Must Die and Virtual Riot both released albums I really liked last year. There was also that Ace Aura EP, which was a lot of fun. This is markedly less good than any of those, primarily thanks to having some pretty inconsistent production. Like, the vast majority of the build-ups on these tracks are going for this huge and epic-sounding, like, space opera movie soundtrack feel or something with big, dramatic, and spacious synth washes and orchestral sounds, and it sounds great. But then most of the drops feel oddly claustrophobic in comparison, just in terms of like their stereo depth. It feels like all these tracks collapse in on themselves. And that weird contrast between just the sound quality of the build-ups and drops does amplify a bit of a conflicting tone problem with this album, where it can be difficult to tell at any given point how seriously Subtronics really wants his listeners to take all of this stuff. I get mixed feelings when a track like Gummy Worm goes through so many fun blends of over-the-top sci-fi movie soundtrack sounds and obliterating drops, and for that sample at the very end talking about smoking some shit just to undercut the whole experience. Also kind of wish it wasn't called Gummy Worm. But at the same time, I surprisingly don't actually take much issue with most of these drops either. Like, the EDM drops I really hate are the buzzkill ones. The ones where the drop comes out of left field and is a totally different energy from the build-up. And none of these, like, catch me off guard in that way. Well, there is one exception, Flute Dub, when you got this, like, this big orchestral build-up paying off to this one tiny little flute playing the lead melody over some barely even present drum textures. When that came up, that made me audibly laugh. But aside from that one moment, the vast majority of the drops are at least able to match the build-ups in terms of their energy level, and the vocal guests are all pretty solid too. I liked the appearances of Grabbits and Nev and Christina Soto. Only one I didn't really care for was Sullivan King on Take Flight VIP. I'm not a fan of his whispering delivery there, even if the middle screaming was fine, and the track's last drop, where it had a bit more of a techno flavor, was actually one of the best drops here. Also can't deny I had a lot of fun with all the tracks that just went hard on amen breaks like Cyclops Rocks and Morning Coffee. I bet Subtronics could make a whole kick-ass breakcore album if he wanted. And I also quite liked how this album flowed, how each track felt like it was leading into the next one, and not necessarily in a continuous mix kind of way, just how musically there's a lot of really good segues between tracks. No, I'm sorry, I can't hate on this album. I enjoyed myself through most of it. I definitely don't love it. I'm probably never going to come back to it, and I can concede the production can be kind of trash in many moments. But I do like the over-the-top orchestral stuff in most of these build-ups, and I don't think the drops ruin the experience either. If this album were as well engineered as that Must Die one last year, I'd probably prefer this over it. But it's not, so yeah. But yeah, the album's not bad at all. Heavily flawed, yes, of course. I would understand if you hated it, but I thought it was perfectly fine. I'll even just barely let it get away with a solid 7 out of 10. Fight me. I don't know. Next up from eoni, NIMN. Okay, this is a project from a fairly obscure Italian IDM producer, Ugo Basile. He's been at it since the early 2000s, working under various aliases. But this is his first ever release under this particular name, and I haven't heard anything else he's made. I only knew about this because one of the regular commenters on this channel recommended it to me via Twitter out of nowhere, and from what I can tell, it's pretty much picked up no buzz outside of those who regularly watch my videos. Could probably use some more though, since this is a pretty solid ambient IDM project. This project takes on a lot of very clean and polished synth textures and timbres that wouldn't be out of place on, say, a John Tejada album or that one Marc Leclerc album or something, glitches all of them beyond recognition, and scatters all the pieces into a formless ambient slurry. Every track is full of tiny micro details and peaceful synth pads, a lot of pitched down vocals incorporated into the mix as well, though never to the point of becoming a particular focus. But there's never much of a defined structure to any of it, and most of these tracks kind of go for the same kinds of sounds throughout. Well, there is also a bit more variety when we get into the second half of the album, like how Lava goes for a bit more dramatic approach with some synth organs and chopped up vocals, or how Alcatrap has a lot of plucking guitars, or how Mano no Aware has more pronounced minimal techno influences, or how Prime Numbers has a lot more focus on percussive textures, or how the 1 minute interlude dispersion angle is surprisingly an attention-grabbing highlight. The first half of the album does run together a lot more, but regardless, the overall listening experience is very nice, well stimulating and tactile in its approach to sound design. All of it is extremely well produced and well crafted for what it's going for. I wouldn't say it's anything especially mind-blowing for me, but I liked it a lot, so if this all sounds interesting to you, give it a shot. Might grow on me later too, we'll see. As of right now, I think I can give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from ATTLAS, Carry It With You. Got another new one from ATTLAS here. I covered his last album, Out Here With You, in Volume 4 of Some Stuff I Missed, and thought it was very nice, so I decided to give this a shot as well. By my ears, it's pretty much in the exact same vein as his last album, same mix of low-key, watery progressive house and emotional piano performances, and also like his last album, I thought it was quite solid. Not every track hits as much as the next. There are a few like You're Gonna Miss It All and To Catch a Glimpse that didn't leave that strong an impression on me, and I'd be lying if I said any of these tracks hit the heights of his track Out There With You. But the moments that did really click for me here still made it worth the experience. The skittering IDM beats and cheering vocal samples of Waterbug were really striking, also like the triumphant melodies of Last Walk, the emotional piano interlude, reminiscences of youth, the fairly reserved grooves of Followed Me Home in the title track, the more energetic flares of Rail Yards and Sun episode, the latter even kind of gave me mild, like, Solar Fields vibes. I don't think I liked this album more as a whole than his last one, but I still thought it was all very enjoyable for what it was and retained the same refreshing and comforting vibe that project had. If you liked his last one, then you'll like this one as well. I'll give this a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from HATENA, Years of Failure. Oh, this is a pretty interesting one. Check this out on a recommendation from Not Real Music. It's a strange mix of plunderphonics, future funk, and abrasive glitch and noise styles. Definitely one of the more out-of-the-box takes I've seen on these particular genres. I'm reminded a lot of Mr. Wazo and his more experimental work, just the way everything seems to devolve into pure sonic chaos and chopped up hyperspeed samples pretty often, but at the same time trying not to sacrifice the core grooves underneath it all. There's still quite a few regular future funk bangers here. Now, on one hand, I do feel like the experimentalism is the core appeal of the album as a whole, not so much the grooves themselves. Even the most stable ones have an odd, like, treble-heavy hollowness to their sound and feel like they're barely contained within reality, ready to fall apart at any moment. And fall apart they very much will. That chaotic approach to everything definitely leads to an experience where you're constantly kept on your toes. But at the same time, the tracks that do still attempt more of a regular plunderphonic future funk approach were almost always my favorite moments on here. See tracks like Blood, WN2, or EX11, and my personal favorite, 131, 21, 40, 10. I liked how that one contained many odd parts where the tempo and sample pitching totally shifts around, but still made sure the house groove at its core was as strong as it could be. While there are a few more experimental moments that do grab me, especially Uncomfort and how it devolves from something fairly laid back sounding into noisy abstraction, Most of the more abstract moments didn't grab me as much, so I guess take that all as you will. I don't really see myself hanging onto it or coming back to it a lot in the future, but I did enjoy myself the whole way through and have to give it points for the creativity on display and how much of a unique identity HATENA has nailed down. So I definitely say it's worth giving a shot. I'll let it get away with a 7.5 out of 10 as well. Next up, from Skee Mask, A. And here we got a surprise release from Skee Mask, an archive compilation of unmastered material he made between 2015 and 2019 that he self-released as a Bandcamp exclusive with no prior lead-up, just as the Ukraine crisis was starting to unfold, and initially had all its proceeds going towards humanitarian relief organizations in support of Ukraine, although the donation period is over at this point. I wasn't exactly going into this project expecting a masterpiece on the level of his Pool album last year. Given the manner in which it was released, I kind of figured this wasn't going to be anything all that special to write home about. And it's not. But hey, it's Skee Mask, you can always count on him to deliver at least some quality material. The fact that this album is unmastered does mean that a lot of these compositions don't pop out nearly as much as the stuff you'd hear on his regular albums. A lot of them end up feeling rather lifeless and dull. See DIY Letterbox and De Navajo, for instance. And others feel pretty obviously like unfinished demos, like how BFIB sounds like it laid the groundwork for what would eventually become Breathing Method, or how M-Synth Patterns and M-Synth Dub have a lot of fun scattered breakbeat workouts but are being built on top of some kinda ugly sounding synth stabs as a hook that feels too scant to work. But there are cuts that hit regardless. The first two tracks, Driver and Korarkeota, are great. They deliver in his usual crunchy but moody ambient breakbeat mode and absolutely slap. As does later cut Plastics AW, which has more of a dub techno flavor, or At Play, which is a pretty standard early 90s sounding IDM cut with some solid melodies. And Birdland Skit has some emotional and immersive synth ambience with some odd crashing noise elements for texture. And the closer TSC0024 has some nice deep ambience too. At the end of the day, this project is exactly what it advertises itself to be. If hearing Skee Mask's unfinished scraps sounds compelling to you, then you'll certainly find some stuff worth keeping, but I wouldn't say it's essential for anyone besides the diehard fans. I'm personally feeling a 6.3 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Bob Moses, The Silence in Between. Bob Moses are the Canadian deep house duo of producer Jimmy Valance and singer-songwriter Tom Howie. They've been around for a decade now. I first heard about them many years ago when their track Tearing Me Up got nominated for a Grammy, though I never properly looked into them before now since they never looked all that interesting to me. Coming back to their breakout 2015 album Days Gone By, I was really surprised by how much I got into it. It's absolutely a product of its time. The blend of vibey deep house and reverb-soaked indie rock singing sounds pretty well primed for the age of indie band soundtracking commercials. Spotify starting to really go mainstream and people starting to listen to music in playlists to have in the background. But these guys had all the tunes to back themselves up, even good enough to justify tracks that had pretty extended lengths and not much in the way of progression. And it was actually really good. Their second album, Battle Lines, in 2018 went for much more of an 80s pop rock approach to their sound with much tighter track lengths and ended up significantly less memorable. And their third album here ended up around the same level of quality, while sonically somewhere in between the sound of their other two albums. But yeah, this album's fine. It's basically just a Rufus Du Sol album. Tom Howie has more personality as a singer than Tyrone Lindqvist, and there's a lot more focus on like darker minor key compositions. But in terms of like the sound and style of it, pretty much in the same boat. A lot of this stuff sounds like their track On My Knees. Not necessarily a bad thing. I like On My Knees. But I don't think any of these tracks are better than that one. Perhaps, unfortunately, whatever lightning in a bottle they captured with Days Gone By and got all these tracks to feel so catchy didn't strike here. Most of these tracks disappear from my head once they're done. thing about Days Gone By is that most of its lyrics were pretty scant, a lot of cuts that were just kind of the same lines repeated over and over, and the greater element of repetition ended up with those hooks getting stuck in my head more easily. I felt like they were going through that album with more of a house music mindset in that particular way. The stuff on this album and Battle Lines are structured more like traditional pop songs, and have more lyrics, but paradoxically become less catchy in the process. Not to say this album doesn't have some good hooks here and there. Love Brand New and Hanging On are pretty sticky. I also like more the rock textures and acoustic percussion on Back to You, and how Time and Time Again switches between having one of the more heartfelt tunes and just switching to a drop with nothing but stormy bass and house beats. It's really nice. But then you also get something like Broken Belief, which I do feel like they had an admirable idea with that one, but didn't get there in the execution. I read in the iTunes copy that the track was apparently written during the George Floyd protests in summer 2020, and that leads to this track having a much darker and angrier edge than everything else on here. I even heard some lyrics about wanting justice and truth, and how we live in a time where the wise old man's advice isn't useful anymore, which I guess is as meaningful a political statement as you could get from a band like Bob Moses. But on the other hand, God, when I heard the track starting out with Tom Howey rapping, "We live in an era of purpose, we live in an era of youth," I fucking burst out laughing. We really do be living in a society, though. That's all I have to note about the album, though. It'll do really well for those who are big fans of Rufus Du Sol or any dance music with this kind of indie flavor. I personally thought it was forgettable, but inoffensive enough. I'll give it a 6.3 out of 10. Next up, from Charlotte Adigéry and Bolis Pupul, Topical Dancer.
Your cold as ice. I wanna make you feel real nice.
Hey, but if you want some dance music with a political edge, here's something I think that will service you much better. This is a minimal synth pop record with very tight grooves, and the vast majority of its focus being centered around Charlotte Adigéry's lyrics and personality and presence, which cover a lot more varied topics than you'd expect for this kind of music, going into stuff like racism, cultural appropriation, sexual inequality, feminism, personal identity, social media discourse, but also going about these topics with a very lighthearted and humorous approach, and is surprisingly a lot more of a feel-good kind of listen than that subject matter might imply, and it's all pretty well nailed. My mind drifted over to Stereolab as a comparison point in how they combine their political subject matter with bubbly and uplifting instrumentals that make you feel good, also often with lyrics half in French. Now, I'll freely admit that I do feel a bit out of my depth covering a project like this, which puts most of its eggs in the lyrics basket. With how stripped back and simplistic these instrumentals are, I feel like it's not really designed with my usual listening mindset in mind. It's the kind of electronic project that will do great for people who don't listen to mostly electronic music like I do. I mean, I discovered the album through Anthony Fantano's review of it, so there you have it. But obviously not to say this album is lacking on the musical front either. Like I said, all of these grooves are really tight and well constructed, all these tunes are catchy and sound great. It's just that, you know, my tendency towards thinking from almost entirely an instrumental and aesthetic standpoint will be why I'm not as drawn to tracks like It Hit Me or Esperanto, which are great lyrically, but musically are a bit annoying sounding in comparison with some of these others like Blenda or Ceci n'est pas un cliché that have much more defined tunes and melodic grooves, which, to be fair, well outweigh the moments I found comparatively less appealing. I'm not sure how much I'll end up coming back to it after putting up this video. I didn't have an especially visceral first reaction to it, but I definitely had a lot of fun listening to it anyway. I can co-sign it just as much as everyone else already has and give it the strongest possible 7.7 out of 10. Next up, from True Peak Limit, Carriages. Okay, now this is a project I am a full year late to, way back from May 2021. I was mildly interested in it since it was released on the Mesh label alongside all the other projects from artists like Rob Clouth, Lear, Reed Willis, and Max Cooper that I've gone over as really resonating with me strongly. Wanted to see what else the label had to offer and just didn't get around to this one before now. This is a side project from Welsh techno producer Joe Farr that was apparently based off of his field recordings of commuting from Wales to London via train, hence the title Carriages, and synthesized out of said recordings. Now, while I do think this project takes a bit to get going with some less interesting opening two cuts, once we get to the track Timing, I really got pulled into this thing a lot more. These percussive grooves are really satisfying and hard-hitting. They feel like a mix of elements of breakbeat, minimal techno, and UK garage. There are melodies too, though I don't feel like they're ever a primary focus. They're extremely sparse and simplistic when they're there. Meanwhile, the percussion is so varied and well detailed that ends up becoming much more of the star of the show. Though I will also have to give him credit for the few moodier cuts at the end like Hesitation and Spring Death that work quite well for what they are. Especially the latter, which makes for a surprisingly emotionally resonant finish to this thing. While I don't think this album is so amazing that it could be a retrospective year-end list contender, it's definitely a very fun listen for what it is. I can give it my recommendation and give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Katia Krow, The Observer of the Idle Spectacle. Katia Krow's debut album last year, I've called off the search I Know Exactly Where You Are, really impressed me and ended up as one of my favorites of 2021 overall, so of course when I saw he'd put out a new EP, I thought I'd give it a shot and threw it into this lineup. And I feel like if you liked that album, you will like this EP as well. Very much sits in the same mold of electroacoustic folk tinges and dark and foreboding experimental ambience, perhaps even darker and more experimental than the album itself. It's obviously not as complete an experience, only 4 tracks adding up to 20 minutes total, but the appeal remains the same, getting to see various blends of chilling, melancholy ambient melodies get slowly enveloped by noise and strange creepy sound design as a metaphor for finding solitude right before death or the end of the world. All 4 tracks are very nice, but it should come as no surprise that the biggest highlight is the 10-minute closer, The Acolyte of the Surreal Subsistence. Really love all the melted pianos throughout that one and how it ebbs and flows in intensity, but still all remains in fairly comforting and ghostly territory. Definitely worth a shot if you've enjoyed his previous work. I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from Sky H1, Azure. Here's another one left over from the end of last year that I discovered through a Bandcamp daily feature. This is this Belgian producer's debut album on the AD93 label. Got some really nice bassy and brooding ambient synth material here with elements of jungle and 90s techno, but pretty much entirely focused on building its somewhat minimalistic, nocturnal, and enveloping atmosphere. Her particular style sounds like lots of different artists I've heard over the years, but it's kind of hard to pin down any one in particular. There's parts that remind me of Monolith, Nathan Fake, Wayward, Daniel Avery, or even the future sound of London. The latter mostly because the track Silk uses some of those scraping metal effects from their track Papua New Guinea. A reference I can very much get behind. But yeah, it's all really nice. I like the breezy and chilling techno beats and female vocal samples on Dark Light, the more fast-paced grooves of Elysian Heights and Freefall, the melancholy reverb-soaked melodies of Arctis and Birdstrike, the foreboding cinematic ambience of Blade, the more skittering but still well-textured sound of Topaz. There's really no bad tracks in the bunch. I guess Labyrinth isn't an especially memorable start to this thing, mostly just a set of bassy ambient watches that don't really go anywhere, but this track's still pretty good too. Not much else to say though, I like the entire album quite a bit. If it's gone under your radar, make sure to give it a spin. I will also give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Blueshades, In Spite of Myself. Right, now this one actually got recommended to me by Patricia Taxon. Apparently this artist is a fan of hers and sent it to her, and she passed it on to me figuring I would like it. And surprise, I did in fact really like it. For an artist with like zero backing as far as I can tell, and among the smallest audiences of all the artists I'm covering in this roundup, I am really impressed by the production level on display here. You can definitely see a bit of Patricia Taxon influence in terms of some of the bell-like synth textures, introverted vocals, and high detail skittering IDM percussion, the likes of which you might hear on one of her more recent projects like Yes and or Wax and Welcome. But the final effect isn't nearly as flashy as those albums. I'd say it sits a lot closer to stuff like Rumpistle's Dynamo and Ochre's Lemedy, what with its mix of emotionally charged but low-key synth melodies, going up against more acoustic instrumentation, especially like violins and cellos. Not gonna lie, I'm a sucker for this kind of thing every once in a while, and Blueshades did really have the tunes to back himself up. All really nicely adding to that introverted but still really high-effort style and themes of living with social anxiety, which I can definitely relate to. Surprisingly enough, the vocal tracks turned out to be among the most consistent highlights. While Blueshades' own vocals on K to Be Stressed are pretty rough and don't sound great, the tune on that one still made up for it. And the vast majority of the vocals are handled by guest singer Luke Jones, who has a fair bit more confidence and control in his delivery, with a closer Pollination being pretty handily the strongest cut in the bunch. But of course the instrumentals are all really solid too, tracks like Rosewood and Extensione adding some brighter flavors to the warm and welcoming sound of the album. And there's a lot of interludes here, most of which surprisingly feel like they do add something of substance. Tracks like I'll Make or Back in 5 even feel like they could be solid highlights in their own right despite their lengths. I guess I wasn't crazy about the two spoken word advice interludes, they did feel a bit awkwardly delivered, but they don't especially get in the way of the experience either. Not much else to say. This is a very nice album that I enjoy quite a bit. It's almost certainly going to get overlooked, but definitely deserves your attention if you're into this more heartfelt electroacoustic blend of IDM. This gets a very strong 7.7 out of 10 for me. Next up from Ikaru, Monolith. Alright, here's another project from over a year ago, but I only found out about fairly recently. And it's pretty damn interesting. A very unique mix of various tribal and Middle Eastern influences with some slow-moving acid techno and psychedelic rock. Really lush and well-textured stuff, kept me invested from start to finish even despite tracks stretching on for 6, 7, 8, 9 minutes. The kind of stuff that could fit well in some weird Indiana Jones action movie taking place way out in the desert. With that said, it did also kind of run together and end up as background music for me. While there's a wide variety of sounds on display, a lot of these tracks focus on the same blends of sounds. Despite how unique the sound of this one is, I'm oddly left with not much to say about it. But still, plenty of highlights all around. The acid breakdowns of Evocation and Ankara got pretty epic. Sama and the title track had lots of fantastic trumpet solos and added up to one pretty impressive climax. And Yekpare has some pretty catchy steel guitar patterns and makes for a satisfying closer. I don't think this is like a retrospective Your Endless contender, but it is definitely worth listening to, and I will give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Plastikman and Chili Gonzales, Consumed in Key. Wow, talk about things I didn't realize I needed until I found out they existed. I've marked Plastikman's 1998 minimal techno classic Consumed in my addendum video for greatest electronic albums of all time. Though that album is about as stripped back as a techno album can possibly get. It's an album all about going as minimalistic as possible while still feeling like you got something of substance, resulting in grooves made of 90% low end with a few synth string pads here and there. An album that makes you feel like you're trekking down an endless pitch black abyss. So along comes this album, a reimagining of Consumed, in which Chili Gonzales improvised his own piano performances on top of the original. Now, it does seem counterintuitive for a reimagining like this filling in some of the empty space on an album where that feeling of empty space is kinda the point. I'm told Richie Houghton wasn't initially keen on the idea when Gonzales approached him for that exact reason. And it looks like some techno purists were not exactly a fan of this either, but it's not like this is meant to act like as a replacement to the original. So if you are a techno purist, you'll still always have the original. But yeah, if you ask me, simply adding in the piano turned Consumed into a completely different album. Equally as stellar, but with its own separate appeal. It still retains the exact same dark, foreboding, and minimalistic feel of the original, but also gives it a very different sense of emotional depth that's a lot more ghostly and spooky, as if you're making your way through the same pitch black abyss, but now you've lit a torch and are able to see where you're going that tiny bit better. I'm not going to give this album a rating for obvious reasons, but I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and you should definitely check it out. Next up, from Sven Väth, Catharsis. Gotta give a shout out to Sven Väth. This guy's been a working DJ since the 80s, best known for his vinyl-only sets, and he's credited as a pioneer in the world of trance music. I'd known about him for years after having been recommended his 1992 debut album Accident in Paradise, well before starting this channel. I was told it was among the first ever albums to be classified as trance at all, even if most of it was much more ambient leaning. You can pretty clearly hear how that album helped set the scene for artists like BT and Chicane to eventually come in and build upon and help form the trance scene of the mid-90s. Given this guy's legendary status and the fact that this latest studio album marked his first in 20 years, I felt like I had to do my due diligence and very quickly go over my thoughts on his previous studio albums, of which there are technically only 5. Kind of already just gave my thoughts on this, but coming back to it for the first time in years, well, you can tell it's not new, but I think it holds up. It got weirder in certain moments than I remembered, but the best moments are still the obvious dance-centric ones like Ritual of Life, Mellow Illusion, or the title track. Like the last album, but with a worse album cover and a goofy concept that didn't really make any sense, also a markedly stronger and better-paced front-to-back listening experience, probably his best album overall. The last of the 3 albums co-produced by Ralph Hildenbeutel, also his first on a major label, obviously less artsy than the first 2, also more minimal and stripped back than average, but it doesn't feel like a watering down to the appeal of his earlier stuff either. It's nice. Well, that's another frightening album cover, but this album goes for a completely different sound that's much more straightforward, techno and electro-oriented, featuring co-production from people like Anthony Rother, among others. Also with Väth's own very German spoken vocals. It's fine. Like the last album, but a bit higher energy on average, I guess. The Surf GameSport cover was random. But yeah, that was his last album back from 2002. Now we have a comeback after a 20-year hiatus, and a new collaborator in Gregor Trescher, and as it turns out, yeah, it's pretty good actually. Now, on one hand, if you were expecting Väth to come back with some kind of fresh new spin on his sound, this ain't it. This album very much shows him becoming a legacy act, hoping to recapture people's nostalgia for the era he helped innovate. Right down to the album starting with a track called What I Used to Play, where he looks back on those good old days himself. The good news is that he's got the music to back himself up, and plenty of variety to make sure you don't get bored. Not every track is great, there's a few dull techno cuts like The Worm and Nyx that didn't grab me, a couple of tracks that try incorporating various world music influences to mixed results, and the album ends in 2 less memorable ambient leaning cuts. Sylvie's Dream could have been a bigger highlight if not for Väth's processed vocal saying the title. But the moments that do hit make this worth the experience on their own, especially the driving trance grooves of Fire, Mystic Voices, and We Are. The former of those is probably the strongest cut of them all. And even some of the stronger down-tempo cuts like The Inner Voice, Being in Love, and The Cranes of Gangti Valley are really nice. The latter's 90s pianos did in fact hit some nice nostalgia notes. Album can be a bit of a mixed bag as a whole, but I did all around find myself enjoying it more often than not. One angry Discogs comment did have me half worried this was going to be some late period sellout disappointment, and it's definitely not that. The production is certainly more modern sounding than his 90s stuff was, but compositionally there's nothing that feels like it's pandering to current trends. It's more nostalgia bait than anything. But it's good nostalgia bait, so if you've been a fan in the past or think you'd be interested, give it a shot. I'm not hanging on to this, but I'm glad I sat down with it anyway. I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from Passarani, The Wildlife of the Quieter Ones. Also gotta give a shout out to Marco Passarani, an Italian DJ who's been at it since the early 90s and has put out a number of studio albums, although I got lazy for this segment and have only heard this most recent album of his. I saw this one show up in the new music section of iTunes, thought the album cover was cool, previewed through it, sounded like some cool artificial intelligence era ambient techno, bought it on Bandcamp, plopped it on here, and you know, I'll freely admit to having a bit of a stick up my ass when it comes to this particular style, because albums that explore this exact blend of 90s ambient techno and deep house and that kind of thing are a dime a dozen. There's been so many of them over the years, both in the actual 90s and those looking to recapture the sound in the modern era, and there was absolutely a chance that this could just feel really run-of-the-mill and boring. But I actually had a ton of fun with this. This hit the exact same note for me as that Soichi Terada album I started this roundup with, where even if it's stylistically nothing out of the box, the particular execution just put me in a good mood and I thought it sounded really good for what it was. Not to mention it's got some excellent poppy melodic flares and some similar deep house tinges that put it in the same territory. and I think this one's a fair bit better than that one. Now, when you look at this album's track listing, you can see a potential issue. It has 17 tracks and runs on for 69 minutes total. On one hand, nice, but on the other hand, you do risk overstuffing the album at that point, and I'll admit, yeah, I don't think this project quite justified its length as well as it could have. And what's really frustrating is that it was that close to pulling it off. There's just a couple of tracks in the second half that feel like redundant filler and end up making the album feel like it's repeating a formula. Literally a couple. Only two absolutely need to get cut for that reason, being the tracks Complex Beta and Moonstone. Get rid of those. But once you take those two out, you're gold. This album instantly becomes my favorite project in this entire roundup. Aside from that one bit of lagging that kind of takes the thing down if you don't skip it, this album's really well paced. The first half is already like wall-to-wall deep house and techno gems with ambient-leaning interludes placed in just the right moments where they'd be needed, and they all service each other well. There's highlights all over this thing. The album's intro, Albuquerque Arcade Retreat, has lots of really pretty arpeggios, leads into a catchy banger in Theme from FFOM. There's lots of other great melodic bangers all over the place, from Dal 101 to Gravitational Lane to Rays of Thunder to Never-Ending Scrolling, and finishing on the emotional high note of Strawberry Strings. But the ambient cuts are no slouch either. See the chili pads of Revelation, the dramatic and colorful builds of Requiem 1, the boards of Canada-esque red flying kites, or the swirling stream washes of The Sixth Day. But the best cut out of all of them is Equation, which starts out as this dark and brooding acid house cut with all the squirting TB303s echoing around, and then progressively picks up more and more of a gritty deep house groove. I was legit getting Orbital vibes out of this track and getting the exact same sense of excitement that many of their tracks can induce in me so easily. So yeah, I do see myself hanging on to this one. You do need to skip those two tracks I mentioned to get the best possible experience, but this does absolutely get my recommendation anyway. And you know what, thanks to how high its high points are and how many high points there are, I think I'm just going to just barely let this get away with an 8.3 out of 10. Very good. Next up, from Olivier Orand, H+. Wow, now here was a comeback I was absolutely not anticipating. Olivier Orand is the real name of the French artist who previously went by the stage name Hol Bauman and released his then only studio album Human on Ultimate Records. And as you can tell from the fact that I own the CD, this was one of the bigger highlights of that label's entire catalog. Its mix of deep, electronic textures with various acoustic instrumentation created a sweeping cinematic experience that fit perfectly with the usual ethos of Ultimate, yet didn't sound quite like anything else on the label. And coming back to it now, yes, it still absolutely holds up in its entirety. Fantastic album. Though Human came out all the way back in 2008, and Orand has barely released any new material since. He re-released Human under his real name for the album's 10-year anniversary in 2018 with an expanded track listing. He dropped, like, 2 loose singles outside of that, but it's basically been near radio silence from him for the past 14 years. Until suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, he finally released this follow-up album here, H+. I admittedly wasn't going into this expecting this to top Human. That's a pretty damn hard one to top, especially after this long a time out of the game. And while it may not surprise you to hear that I do not, in fact, think H+ is better than Human, I do think it is a worthy follow-up in its own interesting way. This album is less catchy or sonically varied compared to Human, but there's also a very different production style being showcased here that's much harsher and more dystopian sounding. Every synth texture is increased significantly in intensity, perhaps taking some influence from modern dubstep and progressive house styles, including a lot of heavily processed female vocals in most tracks, though still carrying through a lot of the same minor key chord progressions and sense of expansive, dramatic space. I could even go as far to say that this album's better produced than Human, and you can hear more background detail in a lot of these mixes. While all 9 of these tracks sound very similar to me, pretty much all of them have the potential to be a favorite. I like how the album starts in such an attention-grabbing, slow-building but explosive way on The Dawning, and then bookends the album with a retooling of that track called Mars, which recontextualizes those sounds into something that sounds a bit closer to the mixes on Human, especially thanks to the inclusion of those bells. just that little touch to make that track go the extra mile. I like the blaring leads in the climax of Automata, the modulated vocals which are so processed they sound like a malfunctioning AI generator on Robot and Thursday Night, the latter being the stronger cut of the two. Also really like the more up-tempo and energetic grooves of Borderlands, and especially No Memory, and how they contrast with comparatively lower key moments like the title track or the more experimental players of Discord. All around, pretty solid album. While there are definite parallels that can be drawn to his previous masterpiece, which this follow-up will come up short, I think he manages to sidestep the comparisons by expanding the sound of that album into new territory. H+ feels like the dark, dystopian cyberpunk future of the world he created with Human, a spiritual sequel with a pretty big tone shift that's compelling in its own separate way. And yeah, I can definitely co-sign it as worth giving a shot. I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Mark Kellaway, Body of Water. This is a Danish artist that I'd never heard of before that I cannot for the life of me remember how I actually came across. I could have sworn it was either from the official Bandcamp Twitter or from a Bandcamp Daily article, though I can't find any relevant post. Oh well, doesn't really matter. Apparently this guy is pretty prolific, having worked under different aliases and in several different bands over the years, such as Distortion Girls or the Exquisite Test Center. Only his second album to be released under his own name, though. I haven't heard anything else he's been involved with, but yeah, this is a surprisingly striking little ambient project, apparently inspired by pictures of closed public pools he and his boyfriend took during the pandemic. Just 7 tracks, but each of them stretches on a fair bit, 7, 8, 9 minutes, lots of slow-building synthesizer washes going up next to pads of guitars and extremely light techno beats that give me just that little bit of texture and energy for nearly every single one of these tracks to pull me in. And each cut feels distinct from each other as well, be it more obvious differences like the more experimental drone approach of the title track, the processed spoken word over ambience in Waterwalk, or the beautiful flute solos on Octa Evo, or more subtle differences like the different tempos of beat and synth patterns from the fairly standard down-tempo pulse of No Drama Sauna and Float, the slightly slower and brighter Silver Slow, and the more up-tempo and grooving 6/8 beat of Departure. All adds up to a really nice and peaceful listening experience that interestingly hit a similar note for me that Hannah Peel's Furwave did last year. Possibly because the albums are structured in a similar way and occasionally have a few similar textures, but yeah, not much else to say. I can hang on to this. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Batu, Opal. Okay, Batu is the British experimental techno and bass music producer Omar McCutcheon. He's been putting out various singles on various labels as far back as 2013, but he released his debut album this year. I saw it in the new music section of iTunes, I thought it looked mildly interesting, and it very much was interesting. This album has such a unique sound to it that's difficult to describe. Switching off between high detail ambient sections and blends of synth washes as seen on tracks like Atavism, Emulsion of Light, Eelith, or Always There, and much heavier and more percussive moments that have a lot more punch and weight behind them as seen with Convergence, Even Here, Squall, or Spectral Hearts. And the whole thing has an oddly organic feel to it, while also feeling quite dramatic and even epic or cinematic in many moments. Really keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole time and feels really well detailed. The kind of thing that could theoretically fit on labels like Upscale or Mesh, although it has its own feel separate from even those kinds of artists. And this thing flows super well too. Every track fits together in a greater continuous mix and feels like a logical progression of the track that came before. Not to say it's perfect. I don't think the opener Mineral Veins was an especially impactful way to start. Album doesn't really start to grab me until track 3. Also, the track Solace sticks out like a sore thumb in the track listing, being the only track with a vocal feature from Serpent with Feet of all people, and being built on top of this repeated pitch down sample that I'm not huge on, and doesn't really feel like it fits with the rest of the album. Feels more like he needed something to use as a single to possibly pull in a wider audience. Still a cool track, regardless. I just find all the sound design workouts around it to be a lot more compelling. But yeah, this was really freaking good, not quite like anything else out there right now. I'll let it get away with a solid 8 out of 10. Next up, from The Crystal Method, The Trip Out. Well, this one sure came and went, didn't it? The Crystal Method came back with a whole album as a follow-up to the Trip Home from 2018, and it feels like nobody even noticed. Doesn't seem like a great sign, though for as much of a non-event as this turned out to be, it's still pretty decent for what it is. Kirkland did make the mistake of making the album's worst track the lead single. Act Right is a tuneless and unpleasant attempt at like a hip-hop crossover, and while the closer Post-Punk has the highest profile feature in Iggy Pop of all people, he's only there as like a glorified hype man who doesn't even sound hype at all. Over an instrumental that's only slightly better than Act Right. That track was an all-around disappointment too, and I wouldn't be surprised if these two singles killed off any hype for this on their own. But there is actual good stuff on here too. The first 3 tracks are all pretty solid. Watch Me Now is a really fun, rollicking, rock-influenced groove. Housebroken sticks the most to the usual Crystal Method style and has a nice vocal feature from Nas Tokyo, and some fun acid breakdowns. And Let's Trip Out goes through a bunch of cool progressions that keep you guessing where they might go next. Those are all really solid. And I guess Friction is pretty fun too, we've got some more fast-paced metal tinges. Though you also got Free Play, which is an entirely forgettable instrumental cut, and Chemical Mentalist is a fairly mediocre slice of EDM. Yeah, the album as a whole is definitely more anonymous than The Trip Home. That one could have only come from the Crystal Method, while this one could have come from pretty much any other producer of their caliber. But this outfit has also done a heck of a lot worse. This is nowhere near on the level of their self-titled. Absolutely none of this was an active turnoff. It still had its moments. It's really short and isn't much of a commitment to get through. I'm probably not going to remember this, but I thought it was fine. Like a 6.5 out of 10. Next up from Bogdan Rasinski, ATTLAS. Bogdan Rasinski, sorry for butchered pronunciation as per usual, this is an IDM artist who I'll admit I only ever heard about in passing and haven't heard any other releases in their full entirety aside from this one. I need to check out Rave Till You Cry. That one got some solid buzz behind it. But he's been at it since the late 90s. He was a regular on the Reflex label back when they were still a thing. He's shown up on a few Warp Records compilations. He's done remixes for Audacre and Bjork. He frequently sees comparisons to the likes of middle period Aphex Twin and Square Pusher in his particular blend of drill and bass productions. Although this latest album, his first collection of new material since 2007, apparently goes in a bit of a different direction than what he's typically known for. A bit more melodic and mellower, stripped back approach compared to most of his other stuff. I did quite like what I heard of this at first. Really nice mix of smooth and heartfelt melodies, some aching, wordless vocal textures, and lots of skittering and fuzzy percussion sections. A fairly similar mix to what was on that Blueshades album I mentioned earlier, albeit without any string accompaniment or lyrics. That said, as the album went on, the tracks started to get longer and start meandering on with not much of a defined structure to anything, and the longer the album went on, the more I kind of started to tune out and lose interest. Not to say there aren't still some solid moments throughout. The plankier melodies of the third track, the started percussion loops of track 4, the noisier wake-up moment that track 6 provided, and the lighter and more minimalistic touches of the 10-minute closer, which add in some nice field recordings of Rain, which also get the entire last 3-4 minutes of the track all to themselves. All these tracks do technically have actual titles, but they're all nonsensical anagrams of the word ATTLAS, which don't really seem designed to be pronounced. But yeah, as for the album as a whole, while I thought it was cool for what it was, I don't think it really stuck out to me as anything all that special in the grander scheme of the genre. The melodies were nice, this stuff was all very well crafted, I can still see people getting more into it than I did, but it just became background music for me and I've heard plenty of better stuff like it before. I have a feeling I should check out some of his earlier stuff, let me know if there's any old projects of his you love, but for ATTLAS itself, it's alright, probably not going to remember any of it longer term, feeling like a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Mukong Fields, The Fifth Floor. Right, now this was an interesting idea that really stuck out to me when I saw it show up in a Bandcamp Daily article. Mukong Fields is an electronic jazz trio based in Vietnam. they've marked quite the interesting combination of influences like John Carpenter and Sun Ra, mixing analog synth arrangements with jazz instrumentation ranging from saxophone to flute to congas, and attempting to create all these epic-sounding atmospheric arrangements evoking the vast expanses of space. And it turns out they've quite lived up to their marketing. I thought this was great. On some level, this kind of electronic jazz hybrid is pretty much just fan service to my personal taste, but I had a ton of fun with this stuff. I really love how large-scale everything sounds, but also how every track just keeps introducing new instrumentation and new ideas, from synth washes and sax and flute solos to theremins and throat singing and other samples. Every track is built on top of some solid drum machine grooves as well, aside from the opener, which is all ambient, but still creates that kind of big, expansive Tangerine Dream style feel. There's only 4 tracks in total, but all of them run on pretty long, 8, 10, 12, 13 minutes, and they're never boring. It certainly feels like a complete album experience. I suppose the production can feel a bit thin in moments, and given the structure or lack thereof, it can meander a bit. But it delivers exactly what it advertised itself to deliver, kept me interested the whole way through, and if it sounds interesting to you, then I would also recommend giving it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Tamabot, Basic Geometry. Another interesting project I found marked as new and notable on Bandcamp, I think. This is a Spanish ambient composer based in France with little to no audience, but who's been regularly putting out tracks as far back as 2015. And this is his concept album in which every track is based on a geometric shape. Triangle, square, hexagon, heptagon, octagon, etc. And each track has a time signature based on the number of angles in said shape, and tempo and chord structures also related to the angles in each shape, aside from the opening and closing tracks, line and circle. That sounded like a really neat idea to me, so I bought it. And he actually paid me back on Patreon a little while after, curious to hear my opinion on his work, so thank you very much for that, although I was already planning on highlighting him here regardless. Now, when the album first started, I was worried that I just picked up something that was a lot more interesting on paper than it was on execution. The opener line is a single chord that doesn't change for its entire 6-minute running time. True to its concept, but it is a rather boring way to start the album. But the longer the album went on, the more complex and well-defined the sounds it started to explore, and the more it grew on me. And by the time I got to the track Pentagon, I was officially sold on it. The album is as light and minimalistic as its album cover, very much sitting in the same realm as stuff like BET's Between Here and You. But there are quite a few really nice ideas all over this thing. The more peaceful major key moments like Triangle and Octagon are nice enough, but it was some of the tracks that started to lean towards marginally darker sounding compositions that started to pull me in more. See Square, Pentagon, Nonagon, or Decagon. These tracks had such an air of mystery around them that I found quite intriguing, and all had their own neat progressions. Also quite liked the more upfront synth textures of tracks like Hexagon and Circle, and the track Heptagon stuck out like a sore thumb with its much more defined bell-like textures that sound a lot like Visible Cloaks, if you remember those guys from way back when. Album is all around quite nice for what it is. Again, you can probably skip over the opener, I did not really care for that part at all, but once you really get into the meat of it, there is a lot of compelling crystalline ambience to be found here and a lot of interesting ideas. I think it's worth giving a shot if you're into this kind of thing, and it might even grow on me later too, we'll see. I'll hang on to it. Feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Giving that rating a lot today. Next up from Illuvia, Iridescence of Clouds. Alright, Illuvia is one of many aliases used by ambient drum and bass producer Ludwig Simbrelius. Blech. This is a project that originally came out in the beginning of 2021, although with an expanded reissue subtitled Sea of Vapor that came out this past March, now upgraded into a double album. I'd seen the original album show up on a bunch of people's year-end lists in Discogs and otherwise, and the reissue got a ton of traction as well, even at its initial few days of Bandcamp sales going towards relief funds for the Ukraine crisis. Now, first and foremost, the production on this thing is fantastic. Gigantic sounding mixes of ambience with lush synth pads and the very occasional vocal sample covered in reverb. really sounding heavenly and like it's taking you up into the sky, though also with tons of fast-paced amen breaks going over these mixes as well. Just the sound of all of it is absolutely stunning and really emotionally resonant. That said, pretty much every track on this thing sounds almost identical, and it does run on for just over an hour. Not a huge problem, to be fair. I didn't get sick of the sound, though it does become a lot more of a problem if you're listening to the reissue, which expands the album into 2 hours. I did actually listen to the entire bonus second disc, Sea of Vapor, which might have been a mistake. That disc does admittedly have its moments, like Pearlescent, Source of Serenity, and Eagle Vision. Technically has slightly more variety thanks to a few tracks which go entirely ambient, but it also has several tracks which are just alternate takes from the original album, and by the end I did in fact find myself pretty sick of the sound. Turning this into a double album does very much take it into overkill territory, so I'll just recommend the original version on its own, since it doesn't have that problem. Samey as it is one of the most gorgeously produced albums I've heard in this genre in quite some time, and I can definitely recommend giving it a shot. Feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Hannah Peel and Para Orchestra, The Unfolding. When I saw that Hannah Peel was following up her Furwave album from last year with an album performed with a full orchestra, mostly of disabled musicians, I knew I had to check this thing out. And while I regret to inform you that this is less interesting or consistent to listen than I'd personally hoped, it is still quite nice all around. About half of this album is comprised of fairly minimalistic arrangements that, while emotionally resonant, feel like they're moving achingly slow and don't have much going on. See moments like the title track, or the first half of The Universe Before Matter, or Perhaps It Made Us Happy for a Moment. Damn it! Or Perhaps It Made Us Happy for a Moment. Although the track passage did manage to stick with me as a highlight in spite of also being in the same mold as these other moments. There's also a track on here called Wild Animal, which is just kind of weird. It does have a much livelier and more experimental arrangements, though it also features whispered vocals from, I believe, Peel herself, which I think are intoning about how she herself is a wild animal. Not really sure why I know what to do with that. But the other more lively moments of this album always turn out to be the most exciting moments here. Any tracks which have more of a beat, like If After Weeks of Early Sun and We Are Part Mineral, those two were easily the best tracks in the bunch, as you could hear a lot more variety in instrumentation and rhythm and whatnot, and they had quite a bit of nice progressions as well. Also, the first half of Part Cloud and the second half of The Universe Before Matter did quite pull me in a similar way, even if they do have a more peaceful blend to their sounds. Part Cloud does still remain a highlight even when its second half goes off into meandering string pads that aren't as striking as what it started with. Oh yeah, and there's even a little track at the end where Peel narrates the credits for the project over a bed of synth washes. That was nice too. Overall, this album is a bit of a mixed bag, but it's still pretty decent in its worst moments and lots of fun in its best. Probably worth at least one listen if you were a fan of what she'd done before. I'll give this a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from Huerco S, Plunk. Huerco S is the most popular alias for experimental producer Brian Leeds. He released 2 critically acclaimed studio albums before this one, which I only just caught myself up on, coming onto the scene in 2013 with Colonial Patterns, a strange blend of lo-fi sample manipulations and really low-key minimal house and techno beats. Thought that was pretty interesting, even if I don't think I was especially in love with it. But then he really broke out with his 2016 album, For Those of You Who Have Never, and also those who have, a turn for straight ambient material that saw so much acclaim that Pitchfork ended up marking it as among the top 50 ambient albums of all time, and among the top 200 albums of the 2010s decade, regardless of genre. Damn, I mean, if you say so. I don't really see what people have seen so life-changingly great in it, but it was a pretty nice cross between the sound of early Noct Blank material like Seps Vent and Broad Tape Band, with some early Rifts era One O Tricks Point Never, and I could get on board for that. Do kind of wish so many tracks didn't end in abrupt hard cuts, though. Anyway, after a break from using the name into putting out albums under the name Pendant, which I skipped over, he returned this past February with his third album here, and it is yet another left turn. The synths on this one are a lot brighter and more upfront, ending up a lot closer to Coreless and R+7 era OPN territory. Though it does need to be clear, brighter and more energetic by Huerco S standards still results in a pretty dour and meandering listen. I don't dislike any of these tracks, but quite a few of them left me less invested, like the Fear and a Handful of Dust-style freeform plucking excursions of Plunk 1 and 7, or the drier beats of Plunk 4 and 8. The former had some nice little sample chops and the more present tapping percussion for texture, but still kinda left me a little checked out. And then there's the weird hip-hop IDM crossover in Plunk 9, where guest rapper Sir EU tiredly rambles like he just got back from the dentist over an incoherent blend of beats and formless abstract rhythms that never seem to come together in any kind of pulse. That track is better than I just made it sound. I did not like it at all in its first minute or so, but I'd warmed up to it by the end. Sir EU has some good, thoughtful lyrics, too. Aside from that, despite my feeling like this album kinda dragged as a whole, ironically most of my favorite moments were also the longest ones. Plunk 3 and 6 really stuck out to me as big highlights in their fairly subtle but steady synth grooves, each little note feeling like little dots of light shining out in a sea of darkness. Plunk 6 stretches on for over 9 minutes, but I didn't get sick of it. And the best moment of all was the 11-minute closer, Plunk 10, a mostly ambient cut with all these washes of synth chords that feel like you're driving down the highway at night and passing by all the yellow sodium lights. That does appear to be the effect Leeds was trying to achieve for this entire album, going by the Bandcamp description, but this was by far the moment where I felt like that particular feeling connected the most. So I'm kinda left conflicted on Plunk as a whole. It's a pretty big mixed bag with an overall less than pleasant vibe and several moments that don't interest me as much, but just enough compelling standouts for me to not feel like my time was wasted. I don't know. Probably not going to hang on to this, but if you think you'll be interested, then it's probably worth a shot. Very strong 6.7 out of 10 from me. Next up is the self-titled album from Whatever the Weather. This is the new side project from Lorraine James, a British IDM, grime, house, broken beat producer, whatever genre you want to label her stuff under. Under her own name, she's been putting out progressively more percussive and noisy and glitchy material with the projects she released on the Hyperdub label. But Whatever the Weather takes her style into much more ambient-centric territory, a concept record of sorts where every track is titled as a number in degrees Celsius, with one subtitled Intermittent Rain and another subtitled Intermittent Sunshine. This picked up a pretty decent amount of buzz all on its own, and yeah, can pretty much confirm this project is really freaking good. Honestly, it's clicked with me a lot more than the stuff she's done under her own name, even if that stuff was more unique sounding. There's plenty of variety to go around, from the much more subtle ambient compositions like 25 degrees and 36 degrees, which do carry quite a nice sense of stripped back warmth, to tracks that have much more of an IDM flavor like the fittingly icy 0 degrees, and the bright Amen break-covered 17 degrees, even some tracks that focus on MIDI piano performance like 14 degrees. There's a fuzzier and more experimental moment in 4 degrees that goes into much rougher and less melodic territory than anything else, with lots of her own chopped up vocals. And of course there's 30 degrees, where she sings herself without any vocal processing over a fairly standard bouncy IDM beat, and it's all quite nice. Don't really have much to complain about here across the board. Maybe the pacing can feel a bit fragmented, but I do tend to prefer projects like these that have more variety over ones that all sound the same. I think I can hang on to this one, can see it even further growing on me, and I definitely recommend giving it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Lars Leonhard, Gravity. Lars Leonhard is a German ambient composer who I've known about for several years, but strangely enough only ever heard 2 EPs from. I heard his EPs Stella Nova and Burning Clouds, thanks to their release on Ultimate Records back in the day when that label was still in its peak. Though I was completely unaware of his work outside of that, he's actually been self-releasing music since 2010 and has been really prolific in doing so. I think his latest studio album will mark as his 18th to date. And his music is regularly used by NASA to soundtrack their official videos about space exploration. pretty dang cool. Not having heard any of his proper albums, I was curious enough to see what this latest one had to offer. If you're a fan, feel free to let me know about any other projects you might find to be highlights in his catalog. But yeah, this project is a pretty solid collection of dub techno and spacey downtempo and whatnot. There's very little in the way of variety. The entire thing is absolutely the kind of thing that would fit as background music for educational videos from NASA, but all of it is very well produced and creates that expansive sense of atmosphere you'd want out of this kind of music, and I never got sick of the sound, even over 80 plus minutes, which in itself is pretty impressive, especially for an album this samey. I suppose some highlights include the thicker groove of physical objects, the more present and very melodic fragments of Moon's Gravity, the more chilling and cinematic tones of Theory of Relativity, the more intense and dramatic tones of Supergravity. I'm really scraping to come up with unique descriptions for individual tracks here, they all sound more or less the same, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed this whole thing, and I can still give it my recommendation. So, yeah, do make sure to give this a shot if this genre is your thing. I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. And finally, to finish off, from Arcana, is Catalyth. Alright, and to finish this roundup off, we got a project from 2020, which was technically Patreon requested. Someone mistakenly sent me this as a request on the $10 level, having not looked at the rules of my Patreon or seeing the $20 level was closed at the moment. Although the request still looked pretty interesting, so I threw it in here instead. Anyway, Arcana is an artist from Oregon who combines elements of electronic and classical music and covers his releases with fantasy imagery. Reminding me very much of Atlantis the Lost Empire. Sonically, this project switches off between fairly stripped-back piano sections and Two Steps from Hell-style bombastic orchestral arrangements, going over electronic beats and a few occasional modern dubstep-tinged bass washes. And I was admittedly kind of wishing for more out of the electronic elements, especially in the first half of the project, where it felt like these dubstep beats were kind of just awkwardly being placed over all this super elaborate orchestral stuff, and they didn't really blend well together, would leave moments like the title track in particular feel kind of cheesy and overblown. For the first 4 tracks of this thing, I was starting to feel like maybe this is a project that could have been better suited to just focusing on the classical elements, since that stuff clearly had so much more love put into it. Even if I have a feeling all the orchestral sounds are synth imitations and whatnot. With that said, the album did markedly pick up in the second half with tracks like Umi and the Serpent and Echoes of El Ruthen, which implemented the electronic elements a lot more seamlessly. The former had some more frantic IDM beats going up next to this much more intense bass wubbing, and the way they went up against all the plucks of strings and bells, it felt like it fit a lot more naturally together. Also like the progression that one goes through. And Echoes of El Ruthen, for whatever reason, had much better sounding distorted bass than a lot of these other tracks, and somehow didn't cut into the more delicate kalimba-like sounds going over it in moments. And you know what, Pharaoh's Lockstone was pretty solid too, in spite of my issues still being more present at that point. Also, I do have to appreciate that, unlike Two Steps from Hell, Arcana does know how to not overdo things. For every big, bombastic, more intense moment, there's a much quieter and more stripped back moment to balance it out. See the piano-driven intro cut Mirth Deep, the solo choir piece Istento Eternum, and the closer Silentium, which just focuses on the string, bells, and operatic soloist in the background without any beats. These were pretty consistently among my favorites. Overall, I'm a bit conflicted on this one. I do always love me some orchestral electronic crossover material, and this was just as fun as I hoped it would be. Though I'd be lying if I said this was the best cross between these two worlds I've ever heard. I don't feel like this guy can fully compete with the likes of, say, Reed Willis or Elon Moore, who I feel are much better when it comes to mixing and mastering, or even coming up with more creative and interesting ideas. This guy has the orchestral parts of his sound nailed. I just want to see more development on the electronic end. Still, this was plenty of fun, and considering this is only this guy's debut album, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up delivering something even more impressive a few more years down the line. This is promising stuff for sure. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. And that's it. That's the roundup. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.